This is the Polar Owl, one of the scariest and cruelest prisons in Russia. What do they do to the prisoners there? You can't even imagine. I will introduce you to the most severe places where criminals can end up. From the Russian Alcatraz for life sentenced, to a place feared even by the most hardened maniacs. Sometimes it even seems that the death penalty is the more humane punishment than the places on my list. In the town of Yelets in Lipetsk, there is a place with a grim past, known among locals as the Yelets Dungeon. It started in the distant year of 1592, when the unfortunate archer Dyakov became the first prisoner. Back then, they kept prisoners in underground pits, covered with wooden planks, and the first stone structure was only built in 1830. Yelets prison is notorious for its cruelty. Convicts, exiles, and rebellious peasants were executed for slightest offenses, either chained to the walls or confined to dark, foodless chambers. Such conditions made it one of the most terrifying prisons in Russia, where a person could go mad out of desperation. But times have changed, and even though they no longer chain people to the walls in Yelets Dungeon, the conditions remain extremely harsh. Information about violence against prisoners leaks from underground sources. Newcomers are welcomed by hardened inmates, turning their lives into a living hell. Fear is their constant companion, and despair sometimes drives them to suicide. The prison cells vary, from modern ones with single beds and linoleum floors, to standard ones where up to 10 people share bunk beds and communal bathroom. There are even guest cells for meeting with families, but entry is granted only through connections and to righteous inmates. Life behind bars in the Yelets Dungeon is a trial even for the strongest spirits. Bathing and changing clothes happen once a week, if they are lucky, and laundry is at the discretion of the administration. Among the inmates, 80% are murderers, and those convicted of serious crimes face a split sentence, first in prison, then in a settlement colony. The most dreaded trial here is the shizo, the punishment cell, not for the faint-hearted, from which people often return with nervous tics. But even with these circumstances, it's not the harshest place I'll tell you about today. The Volgograd Pentagon, or as it also called the Fiery Island, is a very dangerous and cruel place. Hidden amid the vast waters of Lake Novozero on a tiny island near Belozersk, this corner of civilization serves only one purpose – punishment. Once, the walls of the Kirilo-Novozersky monastery stood here, and even earlier, it was a pagan sanctuary. But now, these sacred lands are replaced by prison walls, rightfully considered one of the most severe in Russia. From Volgograd to Belozersk, there is still civilization, but then the real wilderness begins. Forests, abandoned villages, and finally the Fiery Island, accessed by only an ancient wooden bridge. Life on the island is strictly divided. If prisoners are held on the Fiery Island, then on the neighboring Slatky Island, and in the village of Anashkina, there are guards and local residents for whom coexistence with the colony has become routine, albeit with certain rules. In the prison designed for 500 people, PG, as lifelong inmates are called here, make up only a small part of the population. The island at first glance resembles an ancient fortress surrounded by walls and barbed wire, like a stronghold guarding dark secrets. They try to bring the most dangerous people inclined to escape here. The prison staff is focused on immediately eliminating any thoughts of escaping. Only once did someone try to escape from here. The fugitive rode outside the walls in a garbage truck, but returned understanding that there was nowhere else to go. Every criminal in Russia fears hearing the name of this prison when their sentence is pronounced. The Black Dolphin appeared in 1773 and was intended for robbers and participants of the Pugachev Rebellion. Initially, the colony was a penal labor camp where inmates worked on the Yeletsky salt mines. Exiles, people subjected to criminal punishment by being forcibly moved to Siberia, were engaged in salt mining. In 1849, the work in the mines was replaced by the mining industry. In the 2000s, the Black Dolphin was reclassified as a prison for life sentenced. This meant that it would house particularly dangerous criminals, terrorists, cannibals who should never be free again. According to some information, the colony is designed for 1,600 inmates. Unfortunately, or fortunately, there are currently about 900 criminals in it. The Black Dolphin has a special security regime. There are very strict rules in place. The inmates are kept isolated from each other in their cells. Each cell houses 2 to 4 people, and psychologists decide who will live with whom. All of this is done to reduce the number of fights and conflicts within the colony. Some especially dangerous criminals are kept in solitary cells. For example, the cannibal Vladimir Nikolaev, who killed 2 people, dismembered them, consumed some parts, and sold the remaining ones to his acquaintances or in the market. In addition, in the colony, inmates wake up at 6 in the morning, and for the next 16 hours, sitting or lying on their beds is prohibited. When moving from one building to another, the eyes of the criminals are blindfolded, so that they cannot memorize the layout, and the number of staff accompanying them is a minimum of 3 people, one of whom is a dog handler with a dog. Every 15 minutes, prison staff go through all the cells. The inmates always sleep with the lights on, and they are under surveillance around the clock, as video surveillance is installed everywhere. Besides, the cell itself represents a cage within a cage, as windows and doors are additionally separated by thick iron bars. The inmates' walks last for an hour and a half and take place in a special box with concrete walls and a steel mesh roof. Such harsh conditions are intentionally designed so that no one can ever escape from the Black Dolphin, and as time has shown, this has not been in vain. Throughout the modern history of the colony, no one has been able to escape from it. By the way, the name Black Dolphin was given to the colony because of the Black Dolphin figurines made by the inmates. Next, you will learn about the most modern prison for life-sentenced inmates. The history of the prison called Matrosskaya Tishina dates back to the distant year of 1775. Back then, a house of correction for petty thieves and fraudsters was founded in place of the correctional colony. Later, in 1870, it was renamed to the Moscow Correctional Prison, and additional buildings and structures were erected for future inmates. The correctional colony was intended to house 450 inmates, 300 of whom were men and 150 were women. Matrosskaya Tishina housed very famous personalities. For example, politicians Mikhail Khodorkovsky and Sergei Polonsky, the notorious scammer Sergei Mavrodi, and even the thief-in-law Yaponchik. However, the conditions in which such famous and wealthy individuals are kept differ greatly from those of ordinary criminals. Matrosskaya Tishina is a very large isolation facility with many buildings. Some of them have recently been renovated, while others look as if they haven't been touched for several centuries. In the prison, there are so-called VIP cells. They are spacious, with separate showers and toilets, and some even have huge televisions. The repairs there are brand new, and everything looks more like a hotel room than a prison cell. It is said that to get into such rooms, one has to pay a hefty sum. However, no one provides exact figures. But if an ordinary criminal, not a wealthy or famous person, ends up in prison, he should be prepared. Regular cells, designed for 7 to 8 people, are often overcrowded. There has been no renovation for a long time, and the floor and walls look simply terrible. In the buildings where such cells are located, there is a terrible smell. People literally sleep on top of each other, because there's simply no space for mattresses, even on the floor. In cells where 10 to 15 inmates are often kept, there's one toilet, and they are taken to the shower once a week. Needless to say, the conditions in which people are kept are horrific. And next, you will learn about the prison from which no one has ever escaped. The correctional colony, commonly known as Snezhinka, became the newest institution in Russia and at the same time the only one of its kind in the Far East. The facility operates under a special security regime, similar to that introduced in the Black Dolphin area. Construction began in 1996, with a plan to create a detention center for 800 detainees. The construction could only be completed in 2012, and in 2014, the facility was put into operation. The name Snezhinka emerged due to the special shape of the building. The buildings formed a 7-ray structure resembling a snowflake. In 2016, the isolation facility housed only 68 suspects. Most of the building was idle, prompting the decision in 2017 to reclassify the institution from a pretrial detention center to a life-sentenced prison. In September of the same year, the facility began admitting particularly dangerous criminals. The reclassification was not only due to the idleness of the isolation facility, but also because the plan was to close the life-sentence prison Black Eagle, from where a significant portion of the inmates came to Snezhinka. Next on the list is one of the most frightening prisons in Russia. The high-security correctional colony for life-sentenced inmates, called Polar Owl, is located in the Yamal-Nenets Autonomous Okrug. The prison is designed for more than 1,000 people, and currently about 400 people are serving their sentence there. It was opened in 1961, with the first inmates involved in the construction of Transpolar Railway. The prison attained the status of a colony for life-sentenced inmates in 2004. Since then, it started receiving the most dangerous criminals criminals from across the country, information about life inside the colony is scarce, as well as what generally happens there. However, from time to time, very loud scandals occur. In 2014, an officer working in Polar Owl was convicted. According to some information, in 2010, he coerced over 190 people to confess to crimes they may not have committed. He engaged in extracting confessions from inmates, and the methods he used were terrible. If a person refused to give testimony, they were subjected to physical violence. Individuals were seriously affected morally to break their spirits. Besides all these horrors, there were often cases of sexual violence by criminals. No one knows what is happening in the colony right now. By the way, it is the only high-security correctional institution in modern Russia from which a criminal sentenced to death was released. In August 1991, Anvar Musalimov, in a domestic dispute while under the influence of alcohol, strangled his friend and then dismembered him. He was sentenced to execution, but he could not wait for his sentence. Russia imposed a moratorium on the death penalty, so his punishment was changed. Correctional Colony number 56 is located in the Sverdlovsk region. It received the name Black Eagle, under similar circumstances to Black Dolphin. On the prison grounds is a concrete sculpture of a black eagle holding the head of a defeated snake in its paws. It is worth noting that the same self-taught sculptor, Vladimir Krishtopa, who committed 2 murders and rape during the Soviet era, was involved in creating the sculpture for both correctional institutions. At that time, he was sentenced to death, but later, his punishment was changed to a 25-year term. The colony itself was the only prison in the Soviet Union where particularly dangerous criminals, whose death penalty was commuted to a 20-year term in a high-security colony, were kept. After the introduction of life imprisonment as a punishment for criminals, Black Eagle built another special block to accommodate such inmates. The prison opened in 1935 to house particularly dangerous criminals. In 1989, the inmates staged a riot. They took prison staff hostage and demanded money and transport to escape. The facility was surrounded by the military, forcing the inmates to surrender. The only condition they set was not to increase the sentence for the uprising. Whether it was fulfilled or not is unknown. Since then, there have been no more escape attempts. It's worth noting the location of the prison. It is situated on a cliff, making it impossible to dig an underground passage. By the way, this is a fairly common method of escape from prison, and to ensure that staff do not in any way help the inmates, each cell has a sign indicating the inmate's name, along with a detailed description of their crimes and the age of the victims. Life-sentenced inmates are housed in a separate block from those serving 20 to 25 years. They stay in cells with 2 people, and instead of a toilet, there is a simple bucket. Inmates wake up at 6 in the morning, and until lights out at 10 p.m., they are not allowed to sit or lie in their beds. There are 2 libraries for inmates, secular and spiritual. For those serving 20 to 25 years, criminals are allowed to work. In the case of life imprisonment, work is not permitted. Criminals work in the sawmill, carpentry shop, garage, and also in the garden. In terms of conditions, in 2011, Black Eagle was considered one of the cleanest correctional colonies in Russia. Starting from 2017, inmates began to be transferred from the prison, mostly to the correctional colony Snezhinka, and in 2019, it was completely closed. Today, you learned about the most terrifying prisons in Russia that all criminals fear. Thanks for watching.